the key question now is, why is it that strategic alliances so often fail to meet their original expectations, if that's the definition of failure that we want to adopt for the time being? What do you think? What could be possible reasons for an alliance between Tesla and Panasonic to fail eventually? Let's look at a few of the reasons for the failure of strategic alliances that have been identified in the literature. So if we look at the literature on the failure of strategic alliances, we can broadly distinguish 4 categories of factors contributing to the failure of strategic alliances. So the first set of factors or determinants of the failure of strategic alliances is environmental in nature. An alliance might simply fail because customer preferences change. Maybe we've created a partnership to develop lithium-ion batteries, but then the customer preferences shift away from electric mobility. That might be one reason contributing to the failure. Another might be that technological paths shift radically. Maybe a new battery technology emerges, that we're not using lithium-ion batteries anymore, but something else. That could also contribute to the possible failure of the alliance between Tesla and Panasonic. There might be unprecedented regulatory changes, maybe with regards to the work requirements in the Gigafactory plant, maybe with regards to taxation of electric vehicles, state support schemes, and so forth. And there might be cultural differences related to the respective partnering companies. So that's the first set of contributing factors. The second set is strategic in nature, and one, and perhaps the most important reason for the failure of strategic alliances and indeed partnerships in general is that we simply pick the wrong partner, right? So if Panasonic is not the right partner for Tesla, then that might obviously turn out to be a key problem and a key reason for the possible failure of this partnership. And one way in which partner selection could be inappropriate is with regards to their goals and strategies. And if the goals of Panasonic and Tesla diverge, then that can obviously create massive problems in a strategic sense. The same holds true if we partner among rivals. So think about the partnership between Audi, BMW, and Daimler. They're competitors in the same segment, and yet they cooperate to drive automated driving technologies forward. So the fact that they are rivals in the marketplace could actually prove problematic as the partnership evolves. And one way in which they could prove problematic is that knowledge sharing within the partnership might be insufficient. Partners tend to hoard knowledge and tend not to share this with their partner, in particular when rivalry exists in the marketplace. And this example of the strategic alliance between Audi, BMW, and Daimler is a very good example of the difficulty to try to balance cooperation and competition. So that's this idea of co-opetition. So how can they manage to cooperate and compete at the same time? And failing to do so is one of the key strategic reasons for the failure of alliances. And then, last point here, the joint project could simply prove to be infeasible from a technological point of view. If we now look at structural factors, then we might have as a reason for failure the insufficient fit between what we're trying to achieve in our alliance and the type of partnership we have created, or the type of strategic alliance we've created. So we might have chosen, for instance, to work together very closely, as Tesla and Panasonic did, in building up this new Gigafactory and operating this Gigafactory. But at the same time, we might have based our entire partnership on a fairly weakly defined contract. And there would be a mismatch then between the purposeless deep engagement and the fairly loose formalization of what we're trying to do. Similarly related to contracts, alliances might fail because contracts are insufficiently flexible. And partnerships will typically last for years, and technologies evolve during these periods. And so does the focus of the partnership. And contracts needs to allow for such evolution of the content of the partnership. And if the contract doesn't, then that might also be something that contributes in structural terms, to the failure of strategic alliances. The same holds true with regards to lack of specific goals that we're trying to achieve. So the goals need to be very clear from the beginning and transparent to all actors involved if the alliance is to attempt to be as successful as possible. And last, and perhaps most importantly, we have so-called behavioral reasons for the failure of strategic alliances. One top reason for the failure of alliances is that top management at one point in time ceases to be fully committed to the strategic alliance. And the example of Daimler and Tesla is, I think, quite illustrative of this point. At one point in time, Daimler's management simply said, we are now developing battery technologies and drive systems for electric vehicles ourselves. We don't need Tesla anymore. The commitment is reduced and the alliance will come to an end. A great danger is also the turnover, the leaving of important staff members. So if those in charge of the strategic alliance start to leave or begin to leave and others come into play who have not been associated with the alliance from the very beginning, then the alliance might over time break up and cease to exist. Then there are very fundamental human factors that contribute to the failure of strategic alliance. One is intransparency, the other is mistrust and envy. If we start to think that, well, actually, Tesla is taking all the benefits from the partnership with Panasonic, then Panasonic might begin to mistrust Tesla, there might be issues of envy emerging, and hence human factors that lead to conflict within the partnership that will then eventually have as a consequence the breaking up of the respective partnership. So what we've seen so far is that partnerships emerge for different reasons. We've seen that the failure rates are quite high, and we have a good idea now of what possible contributing factors to the failure of strategic alliances really are. But there's one core question that we still need to address, right? And that's the question of what we can essentially do against it. How can we design our strategic alliances such that we minimize the chances of failure? And in very simple terms, we can think about a few fundamental questions that we should ideally address prior to formalizing a strategic alliance. And let me quickly share with you these simple rules for collaborating. So first of all, it's obviously always a good idea to know what you want to get out of this collaboration. And you need to ask yourself whether your partner can essentially provide this. So Tesla needs somebody who's able to manufacture, that is, produce lithium-ion batteries at scale and at increasingly lower unit costs. Can Panasonic provide this? Well, at first glance, this seems to be the case, right? Panasonic is one of the largest suppliers of lithium-ion batteries in the world, even before the start of the Gigafactory project. Then the second key question is, understand your partner's strengths and weaknesses. So you really need to engage in a due diligence of your partner. You need to understand what the partner is good at and what it's weak at. And you need to make sure that the superficial appearance of the partner is not blinding you. And that might be an issue for Panasonic, right? They need to look behind the facade of Tesla and need to understand whether that's a good investment to make and not one that is simply driven by the hype around Tesla, but that there is substance behind it and that in 10 years' time, Tesla will still exist and there will still be demand for lithium-ion batteries to drive the transition to electric mobility. The third question is, understand your partner's capabilities, practices, and culture, and ask yourself whether you're compatible. Will the two work together? Will Tesla and Panasonic fit together in terms of their practices and culture? One a US-American highly dynamic startup and the other a traditional Japanese multinational company. Will that work together and how can you make it fit? Fourth, understand what your partner wants or understand why your partner wants to do the deal. As Tesla, put yourself in the shoes of Panasonic and try to understand why they're doing it. Try to understand what you look like from their side of the fence. And you need to answer in an affirmative manner the question of whether it's a good deal for all. If it's only a good deal for one, then sooner or later the partnership will cease to exist. Fifth, you need to prepare your own organization for collaboration. That is, you need to build trust in the partner. You need to create the appropriate attitudes among employees in your organization so that knowledge is really being shared within this partnership. Otherwise, we have that contributing factor to failure, namely the hoarding of knowledge, insufficient sharing of knowledge. So these are 5 fairly simple questions, but which are very fundamental in nature. If you take them seriously, then many of the failures of strategic alliances could be potentially avoided. And finally, and to conclude that set of simple rules for collaborating, you will need to appreciate that collaborative relationships need to be nurtured over time. That is, you need to invest in building these relationships. You need to build trust among members. You need to have joint events where people from Tesla and Panasonic get to meet each other, and where a climate, let's say, for collaborative activities is really being created. You can't expect 2 groups of actors simply to meet and then to work together perfectly from the start. That needs to be built over time. And I want to end by showing you that strategic alliances and managing strategic alliances is very much about appreciating the fundamental tensions that exist therein and trying to manage them over time. So we have in a strategic alliance the tension between cooperation and competition, right? Panasonic and Tesla, they're cooperating, but in other domains they might be competing. It applies even better to the example of the BMW, Audi, and Daimler strategic alliance that I referred to. We will have in a strategic alliance an element of trust and an element of vigilance, right, of controlling the other. We have in any strategic alliance an element of design and emergence. That is a tension that we examine in our very first session of this course. And then we have an element of autonomy, letting both partners do what they want, but at the same time controlling what they're doing. And what we need to understand as managers of strategic alliances is that these tensions will always exist. And it's also not useful to try to eliminate them entirely. But we need to be aware of them and somehow need to avoid any excessive emphasis on one or the other. And traditional managerial rhetoric focuses very much on vigilance, design, competition, control, and strategic alliances. But the emphasis is now shifting more towards the other end of the spectrum, namely granting autonomy, building a spirit for cooperation, fostering this idea of emergence of cooperative strategies, and then creating trust among cooperating partners. And what Tesla will need to do in managing the alliance with Panasonic is to be aware of these tensions and also adopt an approach that accounts for both the traditional aspect of it and the more contemporary part of it. So many thanks for watching this video on the payoff of strategic alliances. We've now ended our first set of videos on strategic alliances, which are bilateral arrangements largely. And we now move from bilateral arrangements to multilateral arrangements to collaborative networks. So please join me now on the 2 subsequent videos on collaborative networks.